She remembered the moment the world split in two asterisk before asterisk and asterisk after asterisk. Before, she was Miriam Weissman of Krakow, a young mother with dark hair pinned carefully behind her ears, a quiet smile, and a newborn who slept curled against her chest, as if the heartbeat he heard inside her still lived there. After came the morning when soldiers banged on the door, when orders were shouted, when neighbors hid behind curtains, and when fear replaced oxygen in the air. Miriam had heard rumors everyone had. Stories whispered in markets, murmured in stairwells, carried by people who walked too fast and spoke too softly. But nothing prepares you for the moment when the rumor steps into your home wearing a uniform. She wrapped her baby in a blanket so quickly she forgot shoes. She didn't even realize she was barefoot until the cold stones outside bit into her skin. Crowds moved like a single trembling creature, pushed forward by shouts and rifle barrels. Luggage spilled. Children cried. Someone fainted and was stepped over because there was no room to fall. Miriam kept whispering the same words into her baby's ear. "I'm here. I'm here. I'm here." As if saying it enough times would anchor reality. But chaos is stronger than promises. At the station, the crowd surged. People were shoved in different directions, lines splitting, groups divided with terrifying randomness. A soldier grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a waiting truck. Another shouted orders near the platform where mothers with infants were being directed elsewhere. Someone bumped her from behind. Her grip slipped, the blanket loosened, and in the swirl of bodies and screams and orders barking through the air, the impossible happened. Her baby was gone. 1 second, he was pressed to her chest. The next, he was swallowed by the tide of people, carried somewhere she could not reach. She tried to push through the crowd, calling his name, but her voice drowned beneath the roar of panic. Someone grabbed her shoulders, telling her to move, to climb onto the truck, that anyone left behind would be shot. She kept trying to break free. It took 3 people to pull her up. The last thing she saw before the truck doors slammed shut was the blanket her baby's blanket lying, trampled on the ground. Miriam didn't remember the journey after that. Trauma is efficient. It erases what the body cannot bear. She recalled flashes, the sound of wheels grinding over tracks, the suffocating heat, the cries of women who had lost more than she could comprehend, the hollowed-out silence of those who had already surrendered to despair. She remembered clutching her empty arms so tightly her nails left crescent wounds in her skin. But the emptiness inside her nothing could scar that deeply enough. In the camp, women whispered about what happened to infants during deportations. Some said they were sent to special facilities. Others said nothing at all. And that silence was worse. Miriam refused every version of the truth that was offered to her. She chose her own. Asterisk, he is alive. He has to be alive. He is somewhere waiting to be found. Asterisk, hope becomes dangerous in places built to crush it. But Miriam's hope wasn't soft or naive. It was forged from grief so sharp it cut her into someone unrecognized who refused to die before she learned what became of her child. In the barracks at night, she replayed every moment, searching for clues. The angle of the crowd, the direction the blanket had fallen, the uniforms of the men who separated the lines. She memorized everything as if someday there would be a test whose passing grade was survival. And when liberation eventually came, when the gates opened and the world outside blinked in disbelief at its own capacity for cruelty, Miriam stepped out with one purpose. She would not leave those grounds without beginning the search that would define the next 20 years of her life. For some survivors, freedom meant learning how to live again. For Miriam, freedom meant learning how to look for a ghost. In the first months after liberation, Europe felt like a continent made of broken glass, sharp, scattered, and impossible to walk through without bleeding. Survivors wandered from city to city with nothing but names written on scraps of paper, asking strangers if they had seen husbands, wives, children, parents. Every street corner became a bulletin board of desperation. Every face held the possibility of recognition and the crushing disappointment when it never came. Miriam refused to stand still. While others returned to their hometowns, she moved toward the place where her baby had vanished. She learned which trains had operated that day, which stations they passed, which transit points sorted families, which officials handled deportation lists. She pieced it together like an investigation, except the evidence lived in memories blurred by terror. At a refugee center, she met a volunteer who spoke gently, carefully, as if afraid she might shatter. Many infants were relocated. Some were taken by families in the countryside. Some were placed in orphanages. The woman didn't say what happened to the rest, and Miriam didn't ask. Her heart rejected any answer that ended in finality. So she traveled first on foot, then by overcrowded trains, then by charity trucks that rattled like loose bones. Every place she arrived, she asked the same question. Asterisk, did any babies arrive here in late 1943? Asterisk, some people shrugged. Some looked at her with pity that felt like poison. A few gave her lead-stainy embers she carried carefully until they burned out. At a convent, a nun took her hands and whispered, "We did take in some little ones, but records were destroyed when soldiers came." Miriam searched the archive room anyway, flipping through scorched pages, praying for a name, a date, a mark, anything. She found nothing but ashes that smudged onto her fingers like soot from a funeral pyre. Still, she did not stop. Years passed. Countries rebuilt. People tried to move on, but grief on a calendar doesn't shrink. It calcifies. Miriam aged, but the image of her infant son stayed frozen in time quiet. Warm, alive. She carried that memory like a relic, something she refused to let the world bury. In 1951, she arrived at an orphanage rumored to have received children from transports near. The director, a tired man with a gray mustache, led her into a room where dozens of children played. Toddlers, school-aged children, some with the same lost, searching eyes she saw in the mirror. "Look," he said softly, "but please prepare yourself. Many were too young to remember where they came from." Miriam scanned faces one by one. A boy with dark curls too old, a girl with her son's nose but the wrong birth year, a little one with a familiar shape of cheekbone but a scar she didn't recognize. Her eyes caught on a small boy sitting alone by the window, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Something about the way he held himself quiet, almost solemn, pulled her forward. Her heart began pounding in a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. "What is his name?" she whispered. "We call him Samuel," the director replied. "Found near a station during an evacuation. No documents." Samuel looked up at her then. A slow lift of the eyes, a stillness that stole her breath. He had the same depth in his stare that her husband once had, serious, observing the world from the inside out. Her knees nearly buckled. She knelt in front of him, hands trembling as she fought the urge to touch him. "Hello," she whispered. "Do you remember anything from when you were very little?" The boy tilted his head. "Only a sound," he said quietly. "Someone saying, 'I'm here.' Over and over." Miriam's vision blurred. The room tilted. It was the sentence she had whispered to her baby during deportation, the last words he heard before he slipped from her arms. Samuel reached out and touched her wrist, hesitant, curious, a gesture so small yet so enormous it felt like time folded in half. "May I ask?" she said to the director, her voice breaking. "How old he is?" 8, perhaps 9. Her son would have been 9. Hope surged so violently, it hurt. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine that the future might bring her something other than loss. But hope, as always, had sharp edges. After reviewing the orphanage records, the director returned with a tight expression. "There is something you should know," he said. "Samuel was brought here by a soldier, a deserter. He claimed to have rescued the boy from a transport, but he never said which transport, and he disappeared weeks later." The truth dangled in front of her like a thread she could almost grasp, but not quite. Still, she made a decision that would reshape everything that followed. She would not leave without him. Miriam did not sleep that night. She sat awake in the small cot the orphanage had offered her, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, replaying every detail of Samuel's face, his voice, his stillness. She was terrified of believing too much, but more terrified of letting go. For 20 years, she had survived on a fragile thread of hope. Now that hope had a name, a shape, a heartbeat. In the morning, she approached the director with a trembling certainty. "I want to take him home," she said. The director studied her gently, folding his hands on the desk. "Mrs. Adler, you must understand that adopting a child without full records is complicated. We do not know his parents. We do not know his origins." Miriam held his gaze. "Neither does he. But I am willing to give him a life. A real one." The director exhaled slowly, as if carrying the weight of hundreds of similar pleas. "Very well. Spend time with him first. See if the connection holds." And so began their quiet ritual. Every day, she visited the orphanage and sat beside Samuel as he played with wooden toys, drew pictures, or read from worn books. He never rushed toward her, never clung to her, but he watched her carefully, as if trying to decide whether her presence was safe. Miriam respected his space. She knew trust was something built grain by grain, not demanded. One afternoon, as she observed him sketching something on a scrap of paper, she noticed he kept glancing at her. When he finished, he slid the drawing across the table shy, uncertain. It was a simple pencil outline of a woman holding a baby. The woman had Miriam's hair. The baby had Samuel's eyes. The breath left her lungs. "Why did you draw this?" she asked softly. Samuel shrugged. "It's a picture I see in my dreams." That night, she cried for the first time in years. Not from grief, but from the terrifying beauty of possibility. Still, doubts gnawed at her. She needed truth, not hustope. So she began investigating the mysterious deserter who had brought Samuel to the orphanage years earlier. She searched military archives, interviewed displaced soldiers, and followed trails that led to abandoned barracks and half-forgotten testimonies. They only described his habit of carrying a child wrapped in a wool coat. Every clue pointed in the same direction. Samuel had been taken from a transport, but not why, not how. Meanwhile, her bond with Samuel deepened. He began waiting for her visits, quietly hopeful in a way that broke her heart. When she entered the room, he looked up as if checking whether the world still allowed him small miracles. He showed her his drawings. He asked her to read to him. He listened to her voice, as if learning its shape. One cold evening, during a heavy snowfall, the director approached her with a solemn expression. "There is something you must see," he said, handing her a small envelope that had been stored in Samuel's file for years. Inside was a strip of fabric with a faint, almost rubbed-out stitched number. Miriam's hands shook violently. It was a textile tag used for identifying infant belongings during deportations. She recognized the stitching pattern, her sewing, her thread. Her breath caught. Her baby had worn that tag. Her vision blurred as the room spun. She clutched the fabric to her chest, feeling the walls of 20 years of grief and longing tilt and collapse. "Is there any doubt?" she whispered. The director sighed. "None that I can see. But this world has taught us to be careful with certainty." "I won't," she answered. "Not ever." He studied her face for a long time, searching for cracks. Then he leaned his forehead gently against her armor. Wordless trust, raw and fragile. It felt like a lifetime collapsing into a single moment. She filed the adoption request that week, but the past was not finished with her. Months later, a retired officer reached out, claiming he had served with the deserter who rescued Samuel. Miriam met him in a dim cafe where the smell of coal smoke lingered. The man was old, thin, his eyes haunted. "He saved the child," the officer murmured, "but he carried a letter written by a mother during deportation. He kept it, hoping to find her someday." Miriam froze. "A letter?" Her voice cracked. "Do you know what it said?" The officer shook his head. "He kept it sealed. But he believed the child's mother might have survived. He searched for her until he died." Miriam's heart pounded painfully. A letter written during her final moments with a baby one she never knew had survived. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "Where is it now?" The officer reached into his coat and placed a small, aged envelope on the table. Her name was written on it. The envelope felt impossibly light in her hands, like something that should have disintegrated decades ago. something too fragile to carry the weight of a mother's last words. Miriam stared at her name, faded but unmistakably hers. The handwriting trembled across the paper, the strokes uneven, rushed, written in a world collapsing around its author. Her chest tightened as she whispered, This cannot be real." But the officer nodded with solemn certainty. He kept it safe until the end. He said the letter belonged to a woman who refused to stop whispering to her child, even as the world fell apart. Miriam slipped the envelope into her coat, afraid that opening it in public might break her. She walked back to her small apartment in silence, snow gathering on her shoulders, her breath turning to mist. Every step felt like walking toward a memory she hadn't dared to face in 20 years. When she reached her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling, and slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, edges browned, ink smudged but legible. She knew the handwriting instantly. It was hers, a letter she had no memory of writing. Perhaps because trauma had blurred that moment, or because the brain, in its desperation to protect, hides certain wounds from us. She read aloud, voice barely a whisper. "My little one, wherever you are taken, remember, tease, you are loved every second of your life. If you survive, let the world treat you kindly. If you do not know that I go with you in my heart." Asterisk, she covered her mouth as a sound escaped, half sob, half prayer. The letter continued, asterisk, "I do not know if I will live to see tomorrow, but if someone finds you, let them know your name is David." Asterisk. Miriam froze. The name struck her like a blow. Samuel's original name had been David, her son. Her hands shook so violently she had to put the letter down. For 20 years, she had survived on a thread of hope. Now that hope sharpened into something too powerful to contain, she pressed the letter to her chest, rocking back and forth, whispering, "I found you. I found you." The world outside fell away. There was only her, the letter, and the truth that had finally reached her, led by decades of horror, yet somehow still intact. The next day, she went to the orphanage with the letter in her coat. She approached the director, voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I have proof," she said softly. "He is my son." The director, moved to silence, read the letter carefully. When he finished, he placed a hand over his heart. "Mrs. Adler, this is extraordinary. But you know the law requires certainty. Records, documents." Miriam met his gaze. "This letter survived the camps. I survived the camps. My child survived the camps. If that is not certainty, what is?" The director had no answer. Instead, he brought Samuel Aviti into their room. The boy looked between them, confused. Miriam knelt down and unfolded the letter. "This was written for you," she whispered, "a long time ago." David studied her face with quiet focus, as if reading emotions the way others read words. "Is it from my mother?" he asked. His innocence struck her like lightning. Fighting tears, she answered. "Yes, it is." He hesitated. "Do you know her?" Her throat tightened painfully. "I do. Better than anyone." She gave him the letter. He held it delicately, tracing the faded ink with a small finger. She was scared. He sighed softly. "But she loved me." "With all her soul," Miriam replied. He leaned into her, not fully hugging her, but allowing his weight to rest against her arm, a trust he had never offered before. She closed her eyes, savoring the warmth. It wasn't the reunion she had imagined all those years ago, but it was real. It was Paris. Over the next weeks, adoption officials reviewed the case. They compared dates, testimonies, the letter, and the few surviving records. Nothing contradicted Miriam's claim. Every thread pointed toward the same truth. Mother and son had found each other again. One cold morning, the director handed her the final document. "Mrs. Adler," he said with a gentle smile, "it is done. He is yours." Miriam signed the papers with shaking hands. When she turned to David, he looked at her with a question in his eyes, one that required no words. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him gently into her arms. "We're going home." Their home, however, was not a fairy tale. Healing is not a straight path. It loops, retreats, surges. David had nightmares, flinched at loud noises, and sometimes stared into space as if listening to memories too heavy for a child. Miriam woke many nights to the sound of his soft crying, sitting beside him until he fell asleep again. But there were good moments too. David learned to smile. He learned to run without looking over his shoulder. He traced her face with his fingertips, as if memorizing reassurance. Miriam cooked for him, taught him songs her mother once sang, told him stories that weren't about war but about life, warmth, and quiet mornings. They were learning how to be a family one piece at a time. One evening, as they sat by the window watching the sunset, David spoke quietly. "I don't remember her face. My first mother." Miriam felt a familiar ache. "You don't have to remember," she said. "Because I do, and I will tell you everything she would have wanted you to know." He nodded, then rested his head on her shoulder. For the first time, she felt him truly relax. In that moment, Miriam understood something profound. The world had taken everything from them: home, safety, years they could never get back. But it had not taken the bond between a mother and her child. It had only delayed it, a delay that had finally ended. For a long time, Miriam believed the story had finally reached its end, steady, stitched together by small routines and shared silences. But healing is never the final chapter. It is the beginning of a life reclaimed. As the years passed, she watched David grow into himself, into a boy who no longer flinched at footsteps in the hallway, who laughed freely, who asked questions about the world with a curiosity that once had been overshadowed by fear. Still, there were shadows that lingered between them. As he grew older, David began to wonder how he had survived when so many others had not. Survivors often wrestle with questions that have no soft answers, and David was no different. One evening, when he was 12, he approached her with a seriousness that reminded her of the quiet baby she once held. "Why did he save me?" he asked. "The soldier who carried me." "Why me?" Miriam looked at him carefully. Some truths require delicate delivery, because even in dark times, some people choose to act with courage, she said. Not because they know the outcome, but because it is the one thing they can still control. David absorbed her words, then nodded. He did not ask again. As he grew into adolescence, he developed a gentle, resilient, soft-spoken, but firm in his principles. Miriam often saw him sitting by the window with her letter beside him, reading it slowly, as if learning the shape of his own beginnings. One day, he asked, "Do you ever hate the past?" She considered her answer. "No," she said softly, "but I refuse to let it have the final word." Throughout the following years, Miriam shared more of her own story, not the horrors in detail, but the choices, the moments of quiet defiance, the love that had never left her even in the darkest places. She taught him that memory could be a burden or a lantern, depending on how one carried it. David listened with a maturity beyond his age, understanding that their survival was not just luck, it was testimony. When he turned 18, David requested to visit the town where he had been born. Miriam hesitated. She feared the ground itself might wound him, but she also understood the power of reclaiming one's origins. They traveled together on a quiet spring morning. The station had been rebuilt, the buildings restored, the streets modernized. The world moved forward, even when people carried pieces of the past inside them. David stood silently before the place where transports once gathered. His shoulders trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming reality of standing at the intersection of his own history. "Do you think she saw this place?" he asked softly, referring to Miriam's younger self. "Yes," she replied gently, "but she would be grateful to see you here, now alive, standing tall, choosing your own future." He reached for her hand. This time, he held it with certainty. Years later, David pursued studies in social work, driven by a quiet determination to protect those who had been displaced by conflict, poverty, or discrimination. Miriam watched him grow into a man guided not by bitterness, but by purpose. She realized that the love she had poured into him, the love she had carried across decades of searching, had not only saved him, but multiplied through him. He never forgot the letter. In his early 20s, he asked if he could keep it with him permanently. Miriam nodded. "It was written for you," she said. "And now it belongs to your life, not your past." He framed it carefully, restoring the fragile paper between protective glass. The words, though faded, still carried the heartbeat of a mother's last hope. As time passed, Miriam embraced a peace she had once thought impossible. She took long walks, tended a small garden, wrote in journals she never expected anyone to read. Yet the greatest comfort came from watching David thrive, seeing in him the echo of the child she lost and the future he built for himself. When she grew older and her health began to waver, David cared for her with the same quiet devotion she had once given him. One afternoon, as she rested in bed, he sat beside her holding the restored letter. "I always wondered," he said, "why you kept looking for me for so long, even when everyone else told you it was hopeless." She smiled weakly, brushing his hand with her fingertips. "Because a mother's heart doesn't understand the word hopeless," she whispered, "it only understands the word yours." He bowed his head, tears gathering. "You gave me a life twice," he said, "once when I was born, and once when you found me." Miriam felt warmth spread through her chest. "And you gave me mine back," she replied. When she passed peacefully a few months later, David felt grief, but not the shattering kind, defined by regret. Instead, it was a grief shaped by gratitude, a testament to two lives that had been broken apart by history and stitched back together through relentless love. After her funeral, he visited the hill overlooking their town, carrying the letter with him. He unfolded it gently, reading it out loud under the open sky. This time, the words felt different. They were no longer a message written in fear, but a bridge between the woman she once was and the life he now lived. "My little one," the letter began, and David whispered back, "I hear you." He tucked the letter carefully into his coat, looked out at the horizon, and began walking toward the future his mother had fought for, a future she had believed in, long before either of them knew it would come true. And in that quiet moment, he understood the truth. Survival is not only about what endures, it is about what we choose to continue.